Could you sit beside me until the surgery is over? The question rose from the row of cold plastic chairs outside the operating rooms at Hayes Memorial Hospital. Jonathan Hayes stopped in the middle of the surgical floor corridor. Are you speaking to me? He asked. Yes. Annie's voice trembled and caught in her throat. Just for a little while. I'm scared. They just took my mother inside, and I don't have anyone else. 6 people stopped behind Jonathan. Claire Monroe, his executive assistant, nearly walked into his shoulder. 2 attorneys lowered their phones. The financial advisor carrying the merger documents glanced toward the private elevator as if it might leave without them. Samuel Reed, Jonathan's longtime driver and aide, remained silent. Jonathan checked his watch with visible hesitation. It was 8:45 on a cold Monday morning in November. Claire stepped forward. Sir, the Board of Hayes Medical Holdings will vote on the Northbridge merger in 15 minutes. No meeting this year is more important. We should go. Jonathan glanced toward the closed operating room doors. Annie seemed to regret asking. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't know you were busy. I only saw you walking past and Samuel's expression changed. He started to remind Jonathan of the schedule, but his gaze settled on the young woman's shoulders, which shook beneath her faded sweatshirt. I'm sorry, Annie whispered, lowering her head. You probably have something important to do. I shouldn't have bothered you. Jonathan slowly removed his hand from his coat pocket. He did not walk away. The meeting hasn't started yet, he said, his voice calmer than before. I have a little time. One of the men behind him protested. Mr. Hayes, we can't. Jonathan raised a hand. The meeting can be delayed a few minutes. Annie looked up. Tears gathered again, but this time there was a trace of relief in her face. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Jonathan studied her. What is your name? Annie Carter. Who is in surgery? My mother, Grace Carter. Where are your other relatives? There aren't any. She did not say it with self-pity. That made the answer harder to ignore. Claire moved closer. Mr. Hayes, the board members are already gathering. Annie looked at Claire, then at the group waiting behind Jonathan. Only then did she seem to notice the expensive suits, the security badges, and the way everyone waited for him to act. You should go, she said. I shouldn't have asked. Jonathan ignored the suggestion. How long has the surgery been going? Almost 2 hours. They said it could take 6 or 7. I can stay for a few minutes. Annie moved her navy backpack aside. Jonathan lowered himself onto the molded plastic chair. It was too low, and the narrow armrest pressed into his coat. He removed his watch and placed it beside him so he would stop checking the time. Claire stared at him. Should I tell them you'll be late? Yes. How long should I delay the meeting? Jonathan turned toward her. Tell them I'll call. The rest of you can go. Claire hesitated, then led the attorneys and financial advisor toward the elevator. Samuel stayed near the vending machines, far enough away to give Jonathan and Annie some privacy. Annie wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. You don't have to stay because you feel sorry for me. I haven't known you long enough to feel sorry for you. She studied his face, unsure whether he was joking. Jonathan softened his tone. When was your mother brought here? Last night. She collapsed at work. What surgery is she having? A heart valve replacement. Her condition got worse while we were waiting for approval. Approval from whom? The insurance company. Then the hospital. Jonathan's attention sharpened. Which hospital delayed her treatment? Annie glanced around the corridor. This one. He said nothing. She opened her backpack and removed a yellow notebook. Several folded letters were tucked inside the cover. The pages were filled with dates, blood pressure readings, medication names, and symptoms written in neat block letters. I started keeping records in March, she said. Mom would get dizzy, then tell me she was fine. She always says that when she doesn't want me to worry. Jonathan turned a page. You recorded all of this? I had to. Every doctor asked the same questions, and sometimes Mom couldn't remember the exact dates. You understand these medications? Most of them. I read the pharmacy information and look up anything I don't understand. A letter slipped from the notebook and landed beside Jonathan's shoe. He picked it up. The Hayes Memorial logo appeared at the top of the page. The language beneath it was clean, orderly, and cold. Grace Carter's procedure had been deferred pending a review of her financial eligibility. At the time of review, her condition had not met the hospital's threshold for immediate intervention. Jonathan read the paragraph twice. At the bottom was the electronic approval of Victor Lang. Chief Executive Officer of Hayes Memorial Medical Center. Annie watched him. They never said my mother's life didn't matter. They just kept finding polite ways to make her wait. Jonathan folded the letter along its original crease. This case should have been reviewed through the Hospital Assistance Fund. We applied, and they said all the money had already been allocated. Jonathan knew the annual size of that fund. He had praised it at charity dinners and included it in reports to shareholders. It could not have been exhausted by early spring. His phone vibrated. Claire's name appeared on the screen. He declined the call. Annie noticed. Is someone waiting for you? A great many people. You can go. Really? You asked me to sit here. I didn't know you had an important meeting. Jonathan looked toward the operating room doors. Every meeting seems important to the people sitting inside it. That sounds like something a boss would say. It probably is. For the first time, Annie gave him a faint smile. Samuel approached with 2 paper cups and 2 egg sandwiches from the cafeteria. Hot chocolate, he said, handing 1 cup to Annie. Mr. Hayes drinks his coffee black, although he usually forgets about it until it turns cold. Thank you, Mr. Samuel. Thank you, Samuel. Annie placed the untouched sandwich beside her. You should eat, Jonathan said. I'm not hungry. That was not a question. She looked at him. You really are a boss. Before he could reply, Annie's phone rang. She looked at the screen and stood so quickly that the hot chocolate trembled in her hand. It's the surgical desk. Jonathan rose with her. The nurse said only a few words. The last trace of color disappeared from Annie's face. When the call ended, she slowly lowered the phone. They said the surgery is taking longer than expected. Her hands began to shake again. Jonathan could have told her not to be afraid. He could have promised that some of the best surgeons in Chicago were behind those doors. Both statements would have been easy to make. Neither would have meant anything. Instead, he sat down again. Annie looked at him. I'm still here, he said. May I know your name? Jonathan. He gave the answer without ceremony, his eyes moving over the rejection letter. At a hospital like this, the people in greatest danger should be treated first. Annie stared at him. For a moment, even her tears stopped. Her fingers tightened around the hem of her sweatshirt as anger pushed through her fear. If Dr. Evelyn Brooks hadn't taken the risk of signing my mother's emergency admission at the last minute, she would have died at the smaller clinic. Jonathan kept Grace Carter's letter in his hand. Samuel placed Jonathan's coffee on the chair beside him and stepped away again. The cup steamed for a while, then slowly stopped. Jonathan looked at the yellow notebook resting on Annie's lap. You said you started recording your mother's symptoms in March. Annie nodded. Why March? That was when the dizzy spells got worse. Before that, she could hide them. Hide them from whom? Mostly me. She opened the notebook and turned to a page marked with blue tape. Times were written down the left side, with blood pressure readings beside them. Short notes filled the margins. Short of breath after stairs, chest pressure after work, too tired to eat. My mother works as a home health aide, Annie said. She takes care of older people who can't manage alone. She'll sit with somebody else's father all night, make sure he takes every pill, then come home and tell me her own chest pain is indigestion. You took these readings yourself? Our neighbor gave us an old blood pressure monitor. And the medication schedule? I made that too. Annie turned another page. The medication names were written in block letters, with arrows showing times and food restrictions. Jonathan recognized several. Metoprolol, furosemide, warfarin. Warfarin was temporary, Annie said. They stopped it after she started bruising too easily. Jonathan looked at her. What? You corrected me. You sounded like you were only reading the page. I was. A little color returned to Annie's face. Jonathan gave the notebook back. You understand more than most people your age. I understand enough to notice when someone changes an instruction without explaining why. A volunteer in a maroon vest approached with magazines and folded blankets. She appeared to be in her 70s. She recognized Jonathan but did not make a scene. Do you need anything for the young lady, Mr. Hayes? A blanket, please. I'm fine, Annie said. The woman looked at her hands. You're freezing. She placed a blanket beside Annie before the girl could object. Thank you, ma'am. My name is Ruth. I'll be here until noon. After Ruth left, Jonathan said, You thank everyone by name. My mother says people start to disappear when nobody bothers to ask what they're called. Annie pulled the blanket over her knees. Can I ask you something? You already have. Do hospitals scare you? No. Why not? I own this one. She turned so quickly that the blanket slipped from her lap. For several seconds, she said nothing. She looked at the Hayes Memorial logo on the wall, then back at Jonathan. You're Jonathan Hayes. Yes. The Jonathan Hayes? I'm not aware of another one. Her face tightened with embarrassment. Oh God. That seems unnecessary. I asked the owner of the hospital to sit with me. You asked a man walking through a hallway. I told you this hospital delayed my mother's surgery. It did. I showed you the letter. You did. She reached for it. Can I have it back? Jonathan held it out but did not release it immediately. May I keep a copy? Why? Because I want to know how this happened. Annie pulled the letter free. People already know. We didn't have the right insurance. That is not an answer. It was the only answer they gave us. Did anyone explain the hospital assistance fund? A social worker gave us the forms. I filled them out. You? Mom was too tired. What happened after you submitted them? We waited 3 weeks. Then they asked for documents we had already sent. We sent everything again. After that, they said the fund had been allocated for the quarter. The language was familiar to Jonathan. It sounded reasonable, administrative, final. Who told you that? A woman in financial services. I don't remember her name. Would you recognize her? Maybe. Samuel ended his call and approached them. I need a copy of every letter in that notebook, Jonathan said. Annie pulled it closer to her chest. Only with your permission, Miss Carter, Samuel said. She looked at Jonathan. What are you going to do with them? Review every decision. Will Victor Lang see them? Not yet. That answer seemed to reassure her. Annie removed the folded letters one at a time. Samuel photographed each page, including dates, case numbers, and signatures, then returned them in the same order. How many times was your mother denied? Jonathan asked. 3. Here? Twice here. Once at a Northbridge clinic. Jonathan's expression changed. The same Northbridge involved in your meeting? Annie asked. He did not answer. He did not need to. So if the merger happens, the hospital and the insurance company become part of the same system? In simplified terms. That sounds dangerous. Why? Because the people deciding whether treatment costs too much would own the place providing it. Jonathan had spent months listening to attorneys describe the merger as integration, efficiency, continuity of care, and reduced administrative waste. No one had said it the way Annie just had. Annie lowered her eyes to the notebook. My mother used to work as a flight attendant. Later, she became a home health aide. She always said helping someone was simply what people were supposed to do, even if it cost them something. Her voice weakened, but when she needed help, nobody helped her. If you feel Annie's pain and admire the courage she has shown while fighting for her mother, please give this video a like. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from because someone near you may be listening to this story right now too. Jonathan did not interrupt. She almost died in an airplane fire once, Annie continued. She went back into the cabin to pull out a passenger who was trapped. Can you believe that? The corridor seemed to narrow around Jonathan. An airplane fire? His voice came out rougher than he intended. When did it happen? His hand closed over his knee until the veins rose beneath his skin. Annie recoiled at the sudden change in him. Are you all right? Do you know about that accident? Jonathan stared at her, unable to answer. His phone rang. Victor Lang's name filled the screen. Jonathan accepted the call. Chairman Hayes, Victor said sharply. The board is threatening to cancel the merger unless you appear by video immediately. Jonathan's voice hardened. I'll be there in 5 minutes, and you and I have something to discuss. He ended the call and looked at Annie. I don't know whether your mother is the woman I've been searching for. But after her surgery is over, I want to meet her. Annie searched his face. Why? Jonathan did not answer yet. He turned to Samuel. Find out how many patients received the same financial designation as Grace Carter. Start with the last 12 months. Samuel nodded. Quietly? Very. Annie looked between them. Is something wrong? Jonathan picked up his untouched coffee. I don't know yet. The cup was cold. At the far end of the corridor, a surgeon appeared through the double doors and began walking toward them. Annie rose before Jonathan could speak. This time, the doctor was looking directly at her. Dr. Evelyn Brooks stopped a few feet from Annie. Her surgical cap was still on, and a faint line from her mask crossed the bridge of her nose. She did not smile, but her voice was steady. Annie, your mother is stable. We had more scar tissue than the scan suggested, so the procedure is taking longer. But her heart is responding, and we are continuing. Annie pressed both hands over her mouth. Is she going to make it? I believe she has a good chance. I won't promise what I can't control. But nothing has happened that makes me think we should stop. Annie nodded several times, trying to hold herself together. Can I see her? Not yet. I'll come back when we know more. Evelyn's eyes moved to Jonathan, then to the letter in his hand. I didn't expect to find you here, Mr. Hayes. Neither did I. Annie looked between them. Dr. Brooks is the one who admitted my mother. Evelyn removed her cap. Your mother met the medical threshold for emergency care. Signing the order was not an act of courage. It was my job. Victor Lang's office had already denied the case, Jonathan said. Victor Lang's office does not perform heart surgery, but it controls who reaches your operating room. Evelyn held his gaze. Now you're asking the right question. Jonathan glanced toward Annie. I need to join a call for a few minutes. Her expression tightened, though she tried to hide it. You should go. I'm not leaving the building. He turned to Samuel. Stay with her. Samuel nodded. Of course. Jonathan picked up his watch but did not put it on. He placed it in his coat pocket, then followed Evelyn a short distance down the corridor. What do you know about Grace Carter's admission? He asked. Enough to know it should have happened months ago. Why didn't it? Because people who don't have the right insurance are asked to prove they deserve help. By the time the paperwork decides they qualify, their bodies have often made the decision for us. There is an assistance fund. There is a fund in the annual report. Jonathan stopped walking. Are you saying it isn't being used? I'm saying I have treated too many patients who were told it was unavailable. Did you report it? 3 times. To whom? Your office. The answer landed harder than he expected. I never saw those reports. Evelyn's expression did not change. That may be true. It is not the same as saying they were never sent. Jonathan looked back toward Annie. She was sitting beside Samuel now, the blanket around her shoulders and the yellow notebook pressed against her chest. Evelyn followed his gaze. She has been managing her mother's medications for months, she said. She caught 2 errors before Grace was admitted. One was small, one was not. She told me she wants to work in medicine. She has the mind for it. Whether she gets the chance is another question. Jonathan thought of the merger documents waiting upstairs, each page promising efficiency, scale, and reduced costs. None of them mentioned who would be delayed when costs were reduced. Keep me informed, he said. Evelyn gave him a tired look. I intend to keep Annie informed. You may listen. Jonathan accepted the correction. A private conference room stood empty near the nurses' station. Samuel had already arranged a secure video connection. When Jonathan entered, 12 faces appeared on the wall monitor. Victor Lang sat at the center of the boardroom table. Chairman Hayes, Victor said, making no effort to hide his irritation. We have been waiting 27 minutes. Jonathan closed the door. I'm aware. Northbridge's chief executive leaned toward the camera. Our directors are prepared to leave. We need confirmation that Hayes Medical Holdings remains committed to the transaction. Jonathan placed Grace Carter's rejection letter on the table in front of him. Before we discuss commitment, I want an explanation for a patient named Grace Carter. Victor's eyes shifted for less than a second. This is not the proper setting for an individual clinical matter. It became the proper setting when your electronic approval appeared on a denial that nearly killed her. Several board members looked toward Victor. He folded his hands. Financial eligibility decisions are made according to established policy. I do not personally review every case. Your name is on this one. My office approves thousands of administrative actions. Then perhaps your office has been approving too many things you do not understand. Victor's face hardened. Jonathan, one unfortunate case cannot be allowed to disrupt a transaction affecting 20,000 employees. One case? Jonathan opened the photographs Samuel had sent. Grace's letters filled the screen beside the board members' faces. She was denied twice by Hayes Memorial and once by Northbridge. She was admitted only after collapsing. I have ordered a review of every patient given the same financial designation. Victor leaned back. Without informing me? Yes. That review could create unnecessary exposure. To whom? To the company. Jonathan looked at the man who had run his flagship hospital for 12 years. A hospital should fear exposing patients to harm more than exposing itself to scrutiny. The Northbridge executive interrupted. Are you postponing the vote? I am suspending it. Voices broke out around the table. Victor spoke over them. "You cannot suspend a merger of this size over an emotional reaction in a hallway." Jonathan lowered his voice. "This is not a request." He ended the call before anyone could answer. For a moment, he remained alone in the conference room. The dark screen reflected his face back at him. At 50, he looked nothing like the man Grace might have pulled from the burning aircraft 18 years earlier. But memory returned without asking permission. Smoke pressing against the ceiling. A seatbelt jammed beneath twisted metal. Heat spreading across his left side. Someone crawling toward him when everyone else was trying to escape. A woman's voice had cut through the noise. "Look at me. Don't close your eyes." He remembered the pressure of her hand against his jaw. He remembered her coughing as she dragged him toward the exit. He remembered seeing flames catch the sleeve of her uniform before darkness took him. When he woke in a hospital 2 days later, no one could tell him her full name. A report mentioned a temporary cabin attendant, identified only as G. Carter. By the time his investigators found the staffing agency, it had closed. Jonathan returned to the corridor. Annie stood as soon as she saw him. "Did you cancel your meeting?" "I suspended it. Because of my mother? Because I need to know how many mothers were treated the same way." She searched his face. "And the airplane?" Jonathan sat beside her again. 18 years ago, a woman pulled me out of a burning cabin. She kept telling me not to close my eyes. Annie went still. "My mother says that," she whispered. "Whenever someone is scared, she tells them to look at her." Jonathan's hand tightened around the cold coffee cup. "Then I may have finally found her." Before Annie could respond, the doors to operating room 4 opened again. Dr. Evelyn Brooks stepped into the corridor, removed her mask, and looked directly at them. This time, there was relief in her eyes. Dr. Evelyn Brooks stopped in front of them and pulled off her surgical cap. "The valve is in place," she said. "Your mother came through the procedure." For a second, Annie did not move. Then the breath left her in a broken sound. She covered her face with both hands and bent forward, as if the relief had struck her with physical force. "She's alive?" "She's stable," Evelyn said. "The next 24 hours still matter, but the surgery itself was successful." Annie nodded, though tears were already slipping between her fingers. "Can I see her?" "Soon. We're moving her to cardiac recovery. Give us a little time to settle her." Annie stood and reached for the wall because her knees had weakened. Jonathan rose at the same moment. She turned toward him and, without thinking, threw both arms around him. They went rigid. No one had embraced him without warning in years. Annie's forehead pressed against his chest. She was crying too hard to speak, and Jonathan could feel every breath shaking through her. For a moment, his hands remained at his sides. Then he placed one carefully between her shoulders. "She made it," he said. Annie nodded against his coat. Samuel looked away toward the vending machines, giving them the privacy of pretending he had seen nothing. Evelyn waited until Annie stepped back. "You can sit with her once the recovery nurse is ready. She may still be asleep. There will be tubes, monitors, and some swelling. Don't let that frighten you." "I won't." "You probably will," Evelyn said. "That's normal." Annie wiped her face and gave a weak laugh. Evelyn looked at Jonathan. "I need a word with you." They moved several feet down the corridor while Annie stayed with Samuel. "The surgery should have happened months ago," Evelyn said. "The delay made everything harder." "How much harder?" Her heart had been compensating for too long. The tissue around the valve was more damaged than the earlier scans suggested. "Will she recover?" "She has a good chance if there are no complications." Jonathan looked through the narrow window in the operating room doors. Staff moved behind the glass, wheeling equipment and speaking in quiet, practiced tones. Did Victor know how serious her condition was? He had access to the same reports everyone else did. "That wasn't my question." Evelyn studied him. "Yes." His office was told the risk of waiting. Jonathan felt the rejection letter inside his coat pocket. And he denied her anyway. His office called it a financial deferral. A different phrase does not change what happened. "No," Evelyn said. "It only makes it easier for people to sign." A recovery nurse appeared and nodded to Annie. "You can come with me now." Annie looked at Jonathan before following. "Will you still be here?" "Yes." She seemed to need the answer more than she wanted to admit. Jonathan and Samuel waited outside the cardiac recovery unit. The hallway there was quieter, lined with windows that looked across the gray Chicago skyline. Snow had begun to drift between the buildings, light enough to melt against the glass. Samuel handed Jonathan a tablet. I have a preliminary count. Jonathan took it. How preliminary? Very. I asked for every case carrying the same financial designation as Grace Carter. The system is resisting the search. Systems do not resist. People build them to. Jonathan scrolled through the list. 47 names appeared. He looked up. In 12 months? 6. Jonathan returned to the screen. Some cases had been transferred. Others had been marked as pending, deferred, or redirected. 12 names carried a final notation in red. Deceased before treatment. He read the first name, then the second. A 62-year-old veteran with an untreated aneurysm. A mother of 3 whose cardiac procedure had been postponed until she collapsed at home. A retired school custodian who died 2 days before his rescheduled appointment. Jonathan stopped scrolling. Who approved these? Victor's office appears on most of them. Some were signed by financial services. The final authority routes back to executive administration. Does Victor know you pulled this list? Not from me. Jonathan handed the tablet back. Make copies outside the hospital network. Samuel nodded. And Samuel? Yes? No one tells Claire. No one tells Helen. Not yet. Samuel's expression tightened. You trust neither of them? I don't know who Victor trusts. That is enough. The recovery nurse returned a few minutes later. She's awake, she told Annie, who had stepped back into the hall. She's asking for you. Annie turned to Jonathan. Would you come? He hesitated. This should be your time. She asked who was sitting with me. Jonathan looked at Evelyn. She can have one additional visitor for a few minutes, Evelyn said. If he behaves? Annie led him into the room. Grace Carter looked smaller than Jonathan had imagined. A clear oxygen tube rested beneath her nose. Wires crossed the blanket. Her skin was pale, but her eyes were open. Annie moved to the bedside and took her hand. Mum. Grace's fingers closed weakly around hers. I'm here, Annie said. The surgery worked. Grace looked past her daughter. Jonathan stood at the foot of the bed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Grace's gaze moved to his left temple, where a faint scar disappeared into his hairline. Recognition came slowly. You stayed awake, she whispered. Jonathan could not answer at first. 18 years of searching had left him prepared for disappointment. Not this. Because you told me to. Grace looked at Annie. You found him? I didn't know who he was, Annie said. I just asked him to sit with me. Grace's eyes returned to Jonathan. He stepped closer. I looked for you after the crash. I know. He stared at her. You knew? A lawyer came to the hospital, then an investigator. Her voice was weak, so she paused between phrases. I had burns. No insurance. My mother was sick. I left before they finished the paperwork. Why didn't you contact me? Grace seemed almost puzzled by the question. You were alive. That was not enough. It was for me. Jonathan looked at the scar running along her left forearm, partly hidden beneath medical tape. You nearly died saving me. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, gathering strength. There was someone trapped. I went back. You did not even know me. I didn't need to. Jonathan lowered his voice. I owe you my life. Grace opened her eyes again. No. He leaned closer, certain she had misunderstood. You pulled me from a burning airplane. And if I had known you were rich, would that have made your life worth more? Jonathan said nothing. Grace's hand tightened faintly around Annie's. I saved you because saving someone was the right thing to do. Do not turn it into a debt. The words struck harder than accusation. Jonathan looked at Annie. She was watching her mother with the quiet pride of someone who had heard the same lesson all her life. Grace studied him. You stayed with her? Yes. Before you knew who I was? Yes. A tired smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. Then maybe you already started paying the only way that matters. The monitor beside her bed changed rhythm, and Evelyn stepped forward. That is enough for today. Jonathan nodded. Before leaving, he looked back once. Grace had already turned toward Annie, listening as her daughter described the hours outside the operating room. Annie's voice was softer now. She still held Grace's hand as though she intended never to let go. In the hallway, Samuel waited with the tablet against his chest. Jonathan closed the door behind him. 12 deaths, he said. Samuel nodded. Jonathan looked through the glass at Grace Carter, the woman who had once risked her life without asking whether he could repay her. His hospital had asked whether she could afford to be saved. Find the rest, he said. Samuel held his gaze. And when we do? Jonathan touched the rejection letter in his pocket. Then we find out who decided those lives were cheaper than the truth. The following morning, Grace was moved from intensive care to a private cardiac recovery room. Jonathan had ordered the transfer before sunrise, but when Grace learned what he had done, she asked the nurse to send him in. He arrived carrying a leather folder and followed by a hospital administrator, a financial officer, and an attorney. Annie sat beside the window, organizing medication information in her yellow notebook. Grace rested against raised pillows, still pale but alert. "Are all those people here because of me?" she asked. Jonathan glanced behind him. "They're here to make sure you receive everything you need. I need a doctor, a safe place to recover, and my daughter. The room is medically appropriate," he said. It was available. Grace looked toward Evelyn, who stood near the monitor. Evelyn nodded. "That part is true." Grace turned back to Jonathan. "Then the others can leave." The administrator looked offended. Jonathan dismissed them with a small motion. The attorney placed the folder on the table before following the others out. When the door closed, Grace studied it. "What's in there?" "An agreement covering your hospital expenses, rehabilitation, medication, and future treatment. There is also a housing proposal and an education fund for Annie." Annie stopped writing. Grace did not touch the folder. "Why?" "Because you saved my life. I told you that was not a debt. This hospital delayed your surgery. That makes it more than a personal debt. Then fix what the hospital did. I intend to. That is different from buying us a new life." Jonathan sat in the chair beside the bed. "I'm not trying to buy anything." Grace gave him a tired but direct look. Men with money often say that, while placing a contract on the table. Annie lowered her eyes, uncomfortable but unwilling to interrupt. Jonathan rested his hands on his knees. "Your medical bills are the responsibility of this institution. The delay increased the risk and complexity of your surgery. You should not pay for damage caused here. That part I'll accept. The rehabilitation? If Dr. Brooks says I need it." "I do," Evelyn said, "and you're not negotiating your way out of it." Grace gave her a faint smile. "All right. The apartment and the education fund?" Jonathan asked. "No. Your building has unresolved heating violations." Grace's eyes narrowed. "You investigated where we live? I made sure you had somewhere safe to return to." "You could have asked." Jonathan fell silent. Annie looked from one adult to the other. "The heat really is bad, Mom." "I know. And the landlord keeps saying he'll fix it." "I know that too." Grace looked back at Jonathan. "Repairing a dangerous building is one thing. Moving us into a place we could never afford after your attention goes elsewhere is another. My attention will not go elsewhere. You don't know that. You met us yesterday. I have been looking for you for 18 years. You were looking for a memory. That doesn't mean you know the woman in this bed." The answer stopped him. Grace's voice softened. "I understand that you are grateful. But gratitude can become another kind of power if the person receiving it is not allowed to say no." Jonathan looked at the unopened folder. He had entered the room expecting resistance, but not clarity. He had negotiated with governments, unions, and companies large enough to influence elections. None of them had made him feel as unprepared as Grace Carter did from a hospital bed. "What would you have me do?" he asked. "Begin with the people whose names you don't know." Jonathan thought of the 47 files Samuel had uncovered. 12 of them died before treatment. Grace's expression changed. 12? In 6 months. The review is still incomplete. Annie set down her pen. "Were they denied like Mom?" "Some were transferred. Some were delayed. Several carried the same financial designation." Grace looked toward the window. Snow had gathered along the ledge outside. "When poor people die waiting," she said, "the reports make it sound as though time killed them." Jonathan waited, but someone decided whose time mattered. Evelyn moved closer to the bed. "You need to rest. I've rested while other people made decisions about my life. And now I'm making one about your blood pressure," Evelyn replied. 5 more minutes. Grace accepted the limit. A knock sounded. Samuel entered carrying a paper bag from a small restaurant on the south side. Behind him came Ruth, the hospital volunteer, with a hand-knitted blue shawl. "This was delivered for Mrs. Carter," Ruth said. "The card says it's from New Hope Baptist." Annie opened the bag. Inside were chicken soup, cornbread, and a container of peach slices. "Mrs. Powell must have called the church," she said. Grace smiled. "She calls everyone." Jonathan watched Annie arrange the food, shawl, and cards around the room. Neighbors had written messages. A retired teacher offered rides to appointments. A church deacon promised to repair the loose railing outside their apartment. A woman named Laverne had volunteered to stay overnight during Grace's first week home. Jonathan had imagined Grace and Annie as two people with no one. He now saw the difference between having no relatives and having no community. Grace noticed him reading the cards. "We don't have much," she said. "That doesn't mean we have nothing." "No," Jonathan said. "It doesn't." Annie handed her mother the yellow notebook. Dr. Brooks changed the pain medication schedule. Grace looked at the page. "You checked it?" "Twice," Jonathan asked. "Do you always manage her medication?" "Since she got sick." Evelyn nodded toward Annie. "She caught a duplicate prescription at the clinic in August. Same drug, 2 brand names. Grace might have taken both." Jonathan looked at Annie. "How did you notice?" "The side effects matched, so I looked up the generic names." "You're 18. That doesn't make the label harder to read." Grace smiled with quiet pride. Jonathan closed the leather folder and moved it away from the bed. "I approached this badly," he said. Grace waited. "I thought helping meant deciding what you needed and arranging it before you could object. That may work in a boardroom. It usually does. This is not a boardroom." "No." He stood. "The hospital will cover your treatment and rehabilitation. Nothing else will happen without your permission." Grace nodded. "That is a better beginning." At the door, Jonathan paused. "Annie, have you applied to college?" She looked down at the notebook. "Not yet." "Why not?" Grace answered for her. "Because she plans to work after graduation." Annie gave her mother a warning look. Jonathan understood what neither wanted to say directly. There was rent to pay, medicine to buy, and lost wages that would not return because a surgeon had repaired Grace's heart. He did not offer money again. Instead, he asked, "What would you study if cost were not part of the decision?" Annie ran one finger along the notebook's yellow edge. "Clinical pharmacy, maybe post-surgical care." Jonathan glanced at the careful medication chart, then at Grace. For the first time since finding them, he saw a way to help that was not about repayment. It was about opening a door and allowing Annie to decide whether she wished to walk through it. Before he could speak, Samuel's phone vibrated. He checked the message and handed it to Jonathan. The hospital database had returned another group of deferred cases. The number was no longer 47. It was 116. The number remained on Jonathan's screen long after he had read it. 116. He looked through the glass wall of Grace's room. Annie was adjusting the blanket over her mother's feet, while Evelyn checked the monitor. Grace said something that made Annie smile. For a few seconds, they looked like any mother and daughter preparing for a difficult recovery. Then Jonathan looked down at the list again. 116 people had been given the same financial designation. "How many are still alive?" he asked. Samuel's expression tightened. "We don't know yet." "Find out." "I already started." Jonathan handed back the phone. "No one uses the hospital network. No emails. No internal requests that can be traced to us." Samuel nodded. "There's another problem. Grace's community clinic has some of the original referrals, but they won't release anything without patient authorization." Then we ask. Later that morning, Grace agreed to sign a limited release for her own records. She also asked Jonathan to retrieve a folder from the Southside Community Health Clinic, where she had first been examined. "Annie shouldn't leave the hospital," Grace said, "and I don't trust those papers to a courier." Jonathan expected Samuel to go alone, but Grace looked directly at him. "You want to understand what happened?" "Yes." "Then don't send someone else to look at it for you." An hour later, Jonathan sat in the back of Samuel's Lincoln sedan without his usual security convoy. He had changed from his suit jacket into a dark wool coat, though the white shirt and polished shoes still marked him as someone from another part of the city. The farther south they drove, the fewer glass towers filled the windows. Brick apartment buildings replaced office blocks. A church sign advertised a free supper on Wednesday. An American flag moved in the wind outside a narrow row house. Near a corner grocery, 2 men in heavy coats helped an older woman carry bags to her car. Jonathan watched without speaking. Samuel glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "You expected something else?" "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." The clinic occupied the first floor of an old municipal building. Its blue sign had faded around the edges. Inside, every chair was taken. A mother tried to calm a coughing child. An older man in a navy cap filled out forms with shaking hands. A woman at the reception desk spoke to an insurance representative while answering questions from 3 patients at once. Jonathan stood near the entrance until Samuel said, "The line starts there." Jonathan looked at him. Samuel pointed toward 6 people waiting along the wall. For the next 20 minutes, Jonathan remained in line. No one recognized him at first. He watched a nurse explain to a man that his cardiology referral had been returned because a billing code was missing. The man asked how long another review would take. 2 to 3 weeks, she said. "I've already waited a month." "I know, Mr. Davis. I'm sorry." He lowered his voice. "My chest hurts when I walk to the bus." The nurse looked toward the treatment rooms, then told him to sit near the desk so she could find a doctor. Jonathan turned to Samuel. Why wasn't he sent to Hayes Memorial? Samuel did not answer. A woman in her late 60s standing ahead of them looked back. "Because Hayes sends people like him back here." Jonathan met her eyes. She wore a red knit hat and carried a grocery bag full of prescription bottles. "You work for them?" she asked. In a manner of speaking. "That means yes. My name is Jonathan Hayes." The woman stared at him, then gave a short laugh with no humor in it. "Well, that explains the coat." Samuel looked down to hide a smile. Jonathan said, "What is your name?" "Lorraine Bell." "Mrs. Bell, has Hayes Memorial refused you treatment?" "Not me. My husband." Her answer lost its edge. "He needed a heart scan. They said his coverage required another review. 6 weeks later, he died in our kitchen before breakfast." Jonathan felt the folded rejection letter inside his coat pocket. "What was his name?" "Volta Bell." Samuel took out his phone, but Lorraine stopped him. "No pictures. We only need the spelling," Jonathan said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Walter." Samuel entered it. Lorraine's eyes stayed on Jonathan. "Are you here to take another picture with poor people, or are you here to listen?" "I'm here to listen." "Then, don't interrupt." He didn't. She told him Walter had worked for the city sanitation department for 31 years. He had coached Little League, repaired bicycles for neighborhood children, and refused to retire until his knees forced him to. After he died, the hospital sent a letter saying his case had been closed. "They made him sound like a file they finally got off the desk," Lorraine said. Jonathan had no answer that would not insult her grief. When his turn came, the clinic manager recognized his name and led him to a small office. Grace's folder was thin. It contained 3 referrals, 2 denials, and a handwritten note from a physician warning that delay could lead to heart failure. The physician had marked it urgent. Hayes Memorial had changed the status to routine pending financial review. Jonathan read the alteration twice. "Who changed this?" he asked. The manager shook her head. "The digital copy came back that way." "Did you challenge it?" "Every week." "And?" "We were told to resubmit." Jonathan closed the folder. Outside, the waiting room had grown more crowded. On the drive back, he said, "I didn't know." Samuel kept his eyes on the road. "You knew the numbers were improving." "That is not the same thing." "No, it's worse." Jonathan turned toward him. Samuel's voice remained calm. "You praised shorter stays, lower uncompensated care, higher margins. You never asked what had to disappear to make those numbers look clean." Jonathan felt anger rise, then stopped before it reached his mouth. Samuel continued. "Loyalty is not helping a man stay comfortable. Sometimes it means standing in his way before he becomes someone he cannot recognize." For several blocks, neither of them spoke. Jonathan looked through the window at a bus stop where an older woman held an umbrella over a stranger's child. By the time they reached Hayes Memorial, he had made a decision. "Set up an outside audit," he said. "Independent counsel, independent data team, no one who reports to Victor." Samuel nodded. "And the merger?" "Frozen." Jonathan's phone rang before Samuel could respond. "Victor Lang." Jonathan answered. "I heard you visited the Southside Clinic," Victor said. "You hear quickly. You are allowing one emotional case to compromise the future of this institution." Jonathan looked up at the hospital bearing his name. "Then perhaps the future deserves to be compromised." Victor ended the call without another word. Jonathan remained in the back seat for several seconds, staring at the hospital entrance. Employees moved through the revolving doors beneath the Hayes name, some carrying coffee, others pushing wheelchairs or guiding patients through the cold. From the street, the building still looked like the institution he had spent half his life constructing. Inside, 116 patients had already been marked by a system he had never bothered to examine. Samuel turned off the engine. Do you still want the audit team here today? Yes. Victor will know within an hour. Then we have 59 minutes. By noon, Jonathan had assembled 5 people in a conference room on the hospital's 4th floor. Helen Hayes Whitmore sat near the window with her reading glasses in one hand. She had left a charity luncheon after receiving Jonathan's call and had arrived irritated, still wearing the pearl earrings their mother had given her. Across from her sat Laura Kim, an outside compliance attorney who had never worked for Hayes Medical Holdings, Daniel Ortiz, a healthcare data specialist from an independent accounting firm, Dr. Evelyn Brooks, and Samuel. Jonathan closed the door. No notes leave this room through the hospital network, he said. No one contacts internal technology staff without Samuel's approval. Victor Lang is not informed of our progress. Helen leaned back. You called me away from a board event and asked me to hide an investigation from our own chief executive. Are you going to explain why? Jonathan placed Grace Carter's rejection letter in front of her. Helen read it. 1 denied procedure, 116 patients with the same financial designation in 6 months. Her expression changed. How many died? We have confirmed 12. The number may rise. No one spoke for several seconds. Daniel opened his laptop. What exactly are we looking for? A classification tied to financial eligibility, Jonathan said. It may appear under different names. Grace Carter's file used deferred review. Evelyn spoke from the far end of the table, tried Dura. Daniel looked at her. What does that stand for? Deferred resource allocation. Helen frowned. That sounds like scheduling. It sounds like whatever Victor's office needs it to sound like, Evelyn said. Daniel entered the hospital's mirrored database through a secure copy Samuel had arranged. Rows of patient information appeared on the wall monitor. He filtered for DRA. The screen filled. Jonathan stepped closer. How many? 812 over 3 years. Helen slowly put on her glasses. Daniel narrowed the results by insurance type, zip code, diagnosis, and treatment outcome. Patterns formed across the screen. Patients with private insurance rarely received the code. Patients without insurance, with Medicaid under review, or with plans that reimbursed at lower rates, received it often. Another column showed residents. Southside neighborhoods appeared again and again. Daniel studied the numbers. The code does not identify race. Evelyn folded her arms. Show the demographic results. He added the filter. The percentages appeared. Black patients were marked DRA at more than twice the rate of white patients with comparable diagnoses. Latino patients were also affected at a higher rate. The difference remained even after Daniel adjusted for age, severity, and insurance status. Helen stared at the screen. Could this be explained by income? Partly, Daniel said. Not completely. Jonathan looked at Evelyn. Did you know? I knew who kept disappearing from my schedule. Why didn't you come to me directly? I did. She opened her bag and removed 3 printed letters. Each was addressed to Jonathan's office. The first had been sent 18 months earlier. The second followed 6 months later. The third included signatures from 9 physicians. Jonathan read the first page. Evelyn had warned that patients were being delayed despite documented medical need. She had requested an independent review and described the policy as both dangerous and ethically indefensible. At the bottom was a routing stamp from his executive office, forwarded to Hayes Memorial Administration for internal response. Victor's department. Jonathan set the letter down. I never saw this. Evelyn did not raise her voice. That may be true. Helen glanced at her brother. Who screened your correspondence? Claire's office handled routing. And who decided clinical complaints should go back to Victor? Jonathan looked again at the stamp. The answer was obvious. His office had been designed to prevent minor problems from reaching him. Over time, anything inconvenient had become minor. I built the process, he said. Samuel watched him but said nothing. Daniel opened another file. I found the policy document that created DRA. The author line listed Victor Lang's office. Several senior finance executives had approved it. Jonathan's signature appeared on the final governance report that allowed implementation. Helen looked at him. You signed it. I signed a report containing it. That distinction will not matter to a prosecutor. It shouldn't matter to me either. Daniel scrolled through the document. The language avoided direct reference to denying care. It spoke of preserving capacity, minimizing uncompensated procedures, and redirecting cases with unfavorable reimbursement profiles. Evelyn read one paragraph over his shoulder. They made neglect sound like management. Jonathan remembered Lorraine Bell standing in the clinic line, describing how her husband died before breakfast. Walter Bell's name appeared in the database beside the DRA code. He asked Daniel to open the file. The original physician had marked the cardiac scan urgent. Financial Services changed the status to deferred. Victor's office approved it. Add his name to the confirmed cases, Jonathan said. Daniel hesitated. We should verify the death certificate. Verify everything. But do not reduce him to a number while you do it. Helen removed her glasses. Jonathan, if this becomes public before we understand the scope, Hayes Memorial could lose contracts. Northbridge will walk. Banks may freeze financing. People died. I heard you. No, you heard 12. That is not the same as hearing their names. He pushed Walter Bell's file toward her. Helen read the notes. Her hand stopped near the last entry. Sheila's father, she said quietly. Jonathan looked at her. Sheila worked in our parents' house for 14 years. Walter used to pick her up on Sundays. The room fell silent again. The figures had reached someone Helen remembered. Daniel's laptop gave a warning tone. He leaned forward. Files are being moved. By whom? Samuel asked. I can't tell yet. A batch transfer started from executive administration 3 minutes ago. Jonathan looked toward the door. Can you stop it? Not without alerting whoever initiated it. Copy everything first. Daniel connected an encrypted drive and began duplicating the database. Evelyn gathered her letters. This is why I kept paper. Jonathan looked at her. You expected Victor to erase the record? I expected someone to. A message appeared on Samuel's phone. He read it once, then showed Jonathan. Victor had ordered the Information Technology Department to archive all historical financial review files before the merger vote. The timing was no coincidence. Samuel asked, Do you want me to stop the transfer? Jonathan watched the progress bar move across Daniel's screen. Not yet. Let him believe we haven't seen it. Laura Kim spoke for the first time. Once the copy is secure, we need to preserve the chain of custody. If Victor destroys records after learning of an investigation, that becomes more than a compliance issue. Jonathan nodded. Evelyn looked at him across the table. Corruption rarely knocks on the front door, she said. It learns which questions powerful people do not enjoy answering, then builds a home inside the silence. Jonathan looked at his signature on the policy report. For years, Victor had protected him from difficult questions. Jonathan had rewarded him for it. Daniel removed the encrypted drive. We have the files. Jonathan handed it to Samuel. Take it off site. Samuel slipped the drive into his inside pocket. As he reached the door, Jonathan added, and bring me every complaint my office sent back to Victor. Samuel nodded. How far back? Jonathan looked again at the 812 names. All the way. Samuel left with the encrypted drive while Jonathan remained in the conference room, staring at the rows of names on the screen. Helen closed the file in front of her but did not stand. What happens now? She asked. We verify the records. Then we find the families. And the merger? Still frozen. Helen rubbed one temple. Northbridge will not wait forever. Jonathan looked at Walter Bell's file. Neither did Walter Bell. Helen had no answer. By late afternoon, Jonathan returned to Grace's room. The blinds were open, and winter light stretched across the floor. Grace was practicing slow breaths with a plastic spirometer while Annie sat near the bed, sorting discharge instructions into piles. Jonathan knocked even though the door was already open. Annie looked up. You came back. I said I would. Grace lowered the spirometer. That should not be considered an achievement. No, Jonathan said. Probably not. He placed a paper bag on the table. Samuel recommended the chicken soup from a place on 79th Street. Annie checked the label. Low sodium? Jonathan paused. She raised an eyebrow. I was told it was. That is not the same thing. Grace smiled. You may be the first billionaire she has ever interrogated over soup. I doubt I'll be the last. Annie opened the container, smelled it, then checked the nutrition sheet stapled to the bag. Satisfied, she poured a small portion into a bowl. Jonathan watched her prepare the tray. She moved without hesitation, adjusting the bed, checking that Grace could reach the call button, and placing the water cup on the side opposite the IV line. Evelyn entered carrying an updated medication list. Before anyone eats, we need to review these. Annie reached for the paper. Evelyn handed it to her without question. Jonathan noticed. You trust her with that? I trust her to read it, Evelyn said. That is more than I can say for some people who prescribe. Annie compared the list with the yellow notebook. The diuretic changed. Lower dose, Evelyn said. Her kidney function dipped after surgery. And the pain medicine? Only as needed. Annie circled the instruction. She says she doesn't need it even when she does. Grace looked offended. I have never done that. You did it last night. I was resting. You were sweating. Jonathan pulled a chair closer but remained silent while they finished. There was no performance in the way Annie cared for her mother. She asked clear questions, wrote down answers, and corrected Grace without treating her like a child. When Evelyn left, Jonathan asked, Where did you learn to do all this? Mostly on my own. That cannot be the whole answer. Annie closed the notebook. The library has medical reference books. Some are old, but the basics are still useful. I watch lectures online. The pharmacist near our apartment explains things if he isn't busy. You've considered studying medicine? Not medicine. Why not? Too long. Too expensive. What would you choose if neither mattered? Annie glanced at Grace before answering. Clinical pharmacy. Maybe post-surgical care. People go home with 10 bottles and a stack of instructions written for someone who already understands them. Then everybody acts surprised when something goes wrong. Grace said, She has wanted that since she was 14. Annie gave her mother a look. I said maybe. You made a college spreadsheet. That proves nothing. It had color coding. Jonathan almost smiled. Have you applied anywhere? No. Why? Annie folded the corner of one instruction sheet, then flattened it again. Mom has been out of work. Rent is late. Even with aid. College means books, transportation, fees. I can work after graduation and apply later. Grace turned her head. You are not giving up school. I didn't say I was giving it up. You said later. Jonathan had heard that word in boardrooms for decades. Later meant after the next quarter, after the next merger, after the next crisis. It was where important things were placed when people wanted to avoid saying no. What work would you do? He asked. Whatever pays. That is not a plan. It is when the electric bill is due. The directness of the answer ended the conversation for a moment. Jonathan could have offered to write a check. The amount Annie needed would have been meaningless to him. But Grace had already shown him the danger of turning gratitude into control. What if there were an independent scholarship? He asked. Not for you alone. No obligation to work for Hayes. A community board would select the recipients. Annie's expression hardened. You're trying to pay us back again. No. It sounds like it. Grace watched Jonathan carefully. He chose his words. Yesterday, I would have offered you money because it was the fastest way to make myself feel useful. Today, I am asking whether a program should exist for students who already have the ability, but not the chance. Annie did not answer. Grace said, How many students? I don't know yet. Who chooses them? Not me. Who controls the money? An independent foundation. Can Hayes use their stories in advertisements? No. Can the scholarship be withdrawn if they criticize the hospital? No. Grace looked at Annie. Those are better questions than whether you deserve help. Annie sat back. I would still have to apply? Yes. And I could be rejected? Yes. Good. Jonathan looked surprised. I don't want to be chosen because my mother saved you, she said. I want someone to look at my grades and decide I can do the work. That is what should happen. Annie reopened the notebook, though she was no longer reading it. Then maybe, Grace smiled. That means yes when she is trying not to sound excited. It means maybe. A nurse entered with paperwork for Grace's eventual discharge. Behind her came Ruth, the elderly volunteer, carrying a small stack of cards tied with string. These came from your church and your neighbors, Ruth said. Annie untied the string. One card offered rides to rehabilitation appointments. Another promised meals for 2 weeks. A retired nurse named Mrs. Powell had written that she would stay overnight if Annie needed sleep. The owner of the corner grocery offered to deliver food without charge until Grace returned to work. Jonathan read the messages from where he sat. He had assumed Annie and Grace were alone because they had no relatives nearby. Now, he saw a network built from shared meals, church pews, borrowed cars, and people who remembered one another's names. Grace noticed him looking. We don't have money, she said. That is not the same as having nothing. Jonathan nodded. I'm beginning to understand that. His phone vibrated. A message from Samuel appeared. Archived complaints recovered. Press leak detected. Story scheduled for morning publication. Jonathan stood. What happened? Annie asked. Someone is trying to control the story before the facts come out. Victor? I don't know yet. Grace held his gaze. You do. Jonathan looked at the cards in Annie's hands, then at the message again. The article was already written. Before sunrise, the country would be told that a frightened black teenager had manipulated a grieving billionaire into abandoning a merger. Victor had made his next move. By 6 the next morning, the article had already spread beyond Chicago. Jonathan read it in the back seat of Samuel's Lincoln while snow gathered along the curb outside Hayes Memorial. The headline sat above a photograph of Annie leaving the hospital with a paper cup in her hand. Billionaire chairman abandons merger after emotional encounter with mystery teen. The story described Annie as an unidentified young woman with possible financial ties to the Carter family. It suggested Grace had used the airplane rescue to pressure Jonathan into paying her medical bills. It quoted unnamed executives who questioned whether Jonathan was fit to lead after an unresolved trauma from 18 years ago. The article never mentioned the rejection letters. It never mentioned the delayed surgery. It never mentioned the 116 patients. Samuel watched Jonathan through the mirror. There's more. He handed him a phone. Comments poured beneath the article. Some accused Annie of approaching Jonathan deliberately. Others claimed Grace had invented the rescue story. Several comments were openly racist, though many hid behind words like opportunist, welfare case, and professional victim. Jonathan locked the screen. Who gave them the photograph? Security footage shows a freelance reporter entered through the west lobby yesterday. Someone provided Annie's name later. Victor, we don't have proof. We will. At the hospital entrance, reporters stood behind portable barriers. Camera lights turned toward the Lincoln before it stopped moving. Jonathan remained inside. Use the service entrance, Samuel said. No. Annie and Grace are upstairs. That is why I'm not hiding. Jonathan stepped out. Questions struck him from every direction. Mr. Hayes, did Grace Carter demand payment? Are you canceling the merger because of personal guilt? Did Annie Carter know your identity before approaching you? Is the board preparing to remove you? Jonathan stopped at the doors but did not answer. Anything he said without Grace and Annie's consent could make the damage worse. Inside, Claire met him near security. We need a statement before the market opens. Not yet. Northbridge stock is already falling. Then let it fall. Claire lowered her voice. The article names Annie's school. Reporters are calling her teachers. Jonathan's anger sharpened. Get legal protection around the school and Grace's apartment. No public statement using either woman's name without their approval. Victor has already drafted one. Destroy it. Claire hesitated. He says silence makes the accusations look true. Victor is not speaking for this company today. Jonathan entered Grace's room and found Annie standing by the window with her arms folded. Grace sat upright in bed, the blue shawl from her church around her shoulders. A television across the room displayed Jonathan's photograph beside the article headline. Annie turned when he entered. Did you know they would do this? No. Did you know they could? Yes. Her face tightened. That isn't much better. Grace picked up the remote and turned off the television. Sit down, Annie. I don't want to sit down. Then stand without wearing a hole in the floor. Annie stopped pacing but kept her distance from Jonathan. My principal called, she said. A reporter asked whether I've had disciplinary problems. Somebody contacted our landlord. People online are saying Mom made up the plane crash. Jonathan said, I'm sorry. I don't need you to be sorry. I need this to stop. I can send attorneys after the publisher. And then what? They say a billionaire threatened the press because a poor black girl embarrassed him. Jonathan knew she was right. Grace looked at him. What do you want to do? Release the rejection letters and confirm the audit. Without naming other patients? Yes. Without using the crash to make yourself look grateful? Yes. Annie laughed once, without humor. They'll still say we planned it. Then we do not argue with every person who prefers a lie. That's easy for you to say. You get called powerful. I get called a scammer. Jonathan had no defense against that. Grace said, let her speak. He looked at Annie. Only if you want to. I do. Claire arranged a short media appearance in a quiet hospital conference area. Jonathan offered to stand beside Annie, but she refused. If you stand there, They'll only look at you. Dr. Evelyn agreed to accompany her. Grace was not strong enough to leave the room. 30 minutes later, Annie stepped behind a plain lectern. She wore the same faded sweatshirt from the day before. Evelyn stood several feet behind her, not close enough to make Annie appear protected, but near enough that she was not alone. Jonathan watched from the side of the room. Annie unfolded a page, looked at it, then set it down. My name is Annie Carter. I'm 18 years old. My mother is recovering from heart surgery upstairs. The cameras clicked. I did not know who Mr. Hayes was when I spoke to him. I saw a man walking past the operating rooms, and I asked him to sit with me because I was afraid my mother would die while I was alone. A reporter called out, "Did your mother ask him for money?" "No." "Did you know she once rescued him?" "I knew she rescued someone. I did not know it was him." "Are you receiving financial support from Mr. Hayes?" Annie's jaw tightened. "My mother's hospital bills are being reviewed because this hospital delayed her treatment. That is not a gift. It is responsibility." The room grew quieter. Annie continued. "People keep asking whether my mother saved Mr. Hayes so we could benefit later. She saved him 18 years ago. She never contacted him. She never asked for anything. She worked, paid rent, cared for other people, and nearly died because the hospital said she did not qualify for help soon enough." Another reporter raised a hand. "Do you believe race played a role?" Annie paused. "I don't know what was in anyone's heart. I know which neighborhoods kept getting delayed. I know who kept being told to wait. You can call that whatever makes you comfortable." Evelyn lowered her eyes for a moment. Annie looked directly into the cameras. "I did not manipulate anyone. I asked a stranger not to leave. If that is the worst thing I have done, I can live with it." She stepped away before more questions came. Jonathan met her in the hallway. "You handled that better than most executives I know. That isn't a high standard." "No." Her anger had not disappeared, but some of the fear had. "You should not have had to do it," he said. "No, but I'm glad I did." Back in Grace's room, Helen was waiting with a printed copy of the article. She handed it to Jonathan. The language about trauma came from Victor's board memo. Only 6 people received it. "Can you prove he sent it?" "Not yet. But the reporter also quoted our internal estimate of the merger loss. Victor's office created that number." Jonathan looked toward Grace. She was watching Annie return to the room, not him. Helen lowered her voice. "The board is calling an emergency vote. 10 days from now. Victor wants your authority restricted before the audit becomes public." Jonathan folded the article. "Then we have 10 days. To save the merger? To learn how many people it was built to ignore." That evening, Jonathan stayed until Grace finished her meal. Before he left, she asked him one question. "Do you regret sitting down with her?" Jonathan touched the empty place on his wrist where his watch usually rested. "I regret that it took me 50 years to understand why I should." Outside, the reporters were still waiting. Upstairs, Daniel Ortiz had finished restoring another section of the database. The number of patients marked DRA was no longer 116. It was 812. By sunrise, Daniel Ortiz had converted the 812 files into a map. Red markers covered the south side, then spread west into neighborhoods where rent was lower. Public transportation took longer, and specialist offices were harder to reach. Smaller clusters appeared in Latino communities and industrial suburbs, where many patients worked hourly jobs without stable insurance. Jonathan stood in the conference room with Helen, Evelyn, Samuel, and Laura Kim. No one had slept much. Daniel pointed toward the screen. The DRA code affected patients across the city, but not evenly. Black patients were assigned the designation at more than twice the rate of white patients with comparable diagnoses. Latino patients were also marked at a higher rate. Helen folded her arms. "Victor will say income explains it. I adjusted for income, age, insurance type, and severity," Daniel said. "The difference narrows. It does not disappear." Jonathan looked at the names beneath the map. "How many died?" "We have confirmed 31 so far. Another 54 records list no follow-up treatment within the Hayes system. Find out what happened to them. That will require contacting families." "Then contact them." Laura spoke carefully. "We need permission and a process. Some families may already have attorneys. Others may not want to speak with anyone connected to Hayes. They should decide that," Jonathan said. "Not us." He asked Daniel to remove the map. Show the names. The screen changed. Rows of patients appeared with ages, diagnoses, and final outcomes. Jonathan read the first line aloud. Walter Bell, 62, suspected aortic aneurysm, deferred 6 weeks, deceased before imaging. The second file belonged to Marisol Vega, a 41-year-old hotel housekeeper whose breast cancer referral had been returned twice because the translator-assisted financial forms were incomplete. The third belonged to Calvin Price, a Vietnam veteran who had waited 9 weeks for a vascular procedure and lost his left leg after an emergency admission. The fourth belonged to a 7-year-old boy transferred between 3 hospitals while his mother appealed an insurance denial. Jonathan stopped reading. Helen sat down. They called these resource decisions, she said. Evelyn looked at the screen. That is how institutions teach decent people to live with indecent outcomes. They change the nouns. Jonathan reached into his coat and removed Grace's rejection letter. The paper had softened along the folds from being handled so often. We meet the families, he said. Laura shook her head. Not all of them, not yet. As many as will speak with us. Jonathan, you are the owner of the hospital they may blame. They would be correct. The first family agreed to meet that afternoon. Walter Bell's widow, Lorraine, received Jonathan and Samuel in the same narrow brick house where her husband had died. A framed photograph of Walter in his sanitation department uniform hung near the front door. Another showed him kneeling beside a Little League team, one hand resting on the shoulder of a boy holding a trophy. Lorraine did not offer Jonathan coffee. You found his file, she said. Yes. And now you know I wasn't exaggerating. I never thought you were. You didn't think about us at all. That was the problem. Jonathan accepted the words. She placed a folder on the table. Inside were appointment notices, denial letters, and a bill from an ambulance company. Walter's final cardiology appointment had been scheduled 11 days after his funeral. Jonathan stared at the date. Lorraine watched him. They called to remind him. After he died, the message was on our machine when I came home from the cemetery. Samuel lowered his eyes. Jonathan asked, "What would justice look like to you?" Lorraine leaned back. "You people always ask that when you know you can't give it. I'm asking because I don't know. Justice would be Walter walking through that door asking why strangers are sitting at his kitchen table." Jonathan said nothing. "That can't happen," she continued. "So don't use that word like it means everything can be made fair. What should I call it? Responsibility." She pushed the folder toward him. "Tell the truth. Pay the families. Keep the next man from dying while somebody reviews his paperwork. But don't stand in front of a camera and say justice was done. Justice is late." Jonathan looked at Walter's photograph again. Grace had expressed the same truth in different words. The dead could not be returned. Accountability could only prevent their deaths from being treated as meaningless. The next meeting was with Marisol Vega's daughter, Elena, at a laundromat where she worked evenings. She agreed to speak during her break. "My mother cleaned hotel rooms for 23 years, Elena said. She knew something was wrong. The clinic sent the referral. Hayes kept saying the Spanish forms did not match the English forms. Did anyone provide an interpreter? Jonathan asked. A phone number. We waited 40 minutes. Then the call disconnected. Was treatment eventually approved? At another hospital, stage 4, Elena folded a towel, then unfolded it because her hands needed something to do. She died believing she filled out the papers wrong. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. She did not. I know that now. He asked permission to use Marisol's name in the investigation. Elena agreed on the condition that the hospital release the full correspondence. No summary, she said. People should see how polite every letter was. By evening, Jonathan had met 4 families. None asked him for money first. They asked whether he had known, whether Victor would be punished, whether the doctors who objected would keep their jobs, whether the hospital would admit that race and poverty had shaped who was delayed. When Jonathan returned to Grace's room, Annie was helping her walk slowly from the bed to the chair. Evelyn stood nearby but allowed Annie to guide the pace. Small steps, Annie said. Don't lean forward. I know how to walk. You also said you knew when to rest. Grace reached the chair and sat down, breathing hard. Jonathan waited until Annie adjusted the blanket over her knees. You look tired, Grace said. I met some of the families. And they didn't ask me to make things fair. Because you can't. Jonathan sat across from her. Lorraine Bell said justice is late. Grace nodded. She's right. Then what is the point? The point is that late does not have to mean never. Annie looked between them. Jonathan took the list of confirmed deaths from his pocket but did not open it. If I release this, the merger ends. Hayes may lose credit lines. Some facilities could close. Employees who had nothing to do with the policy may lose work. Grace studied him. And if you hide it, the company survives. No, the company continues. That is not always the same as surviving. Jonathan looked toward the window. Snow fell over Chicago in thin lines. I signed the governance report that allowed DRA. Did you know what it would do? No. Did you ask? He did not answer. Grace leaned back, tired from the walk but unwilling to let him escape. Then say that part too. Annie sat beside her mother. People will blame you. They should. They might remove you. They probably will. Then why do it? Jonathan looked at Grace's scar, then at Annie's yellow notebook on the bedside table. Because every improvement in our numbers had someone's name behind it, and I never asked to see them. Grace's expression softened, though not into forgiveness. Now you have. Jonathan took out his phone and called Claire. Prepare formal notice, he said. The North Bridge merger is terminated effective immediately. Claire went silent. Mr. Hayes, the board has not approved that. They will receive the legal filing within the hour. Victor says the company could lose billions. Jonathan looked at Grace. We already know what the profits cost. He ended the call. Across town, Victor Lang received the same notice and threw a glass against the wall of his office. Then he called the head of information technology. Delete the remaining DRA archives, he said. Tonight. For the first time since the investigation began, Victor was no longer trying to protect the system. He was trying to erase it. Grace was scheduled to leave the hospital the next morning. By 8 o'clock, Annie had already arranged the discharge papers in 3 piles: medications, follow-up appointments, and emergency instructions. Her yellow notebook lay open beside them. She copied each prescription by hand, leaving space for dosage changes and side effects. Grace watched from the chair near the window. You know they print those instructions for a reason. They printed your last instructions too, Annie said. One of them was wrong. Grace sighed. You are 18 years old. You should be worried about graduation, not my blood thinner. I can worry about both. Jonathan stood near the door, reading a message from Samuel. Most of the DRA archives had been copied before Victor's deletion order reached the servers. A small portion was still missing, but Daniel had preserved enough to establish a pattern. Evelyn entered with the final medication list. You're going home tomorrow if your blood work stays stable, she said. Grace lifted both hands. Finally, Annie took the list before her mother could reach for it. Evelyn smiled. I expected that. Annie compared the printed sheet with the notes from the previous evening. Her eyes moved line by line. Metoprolol, 25 milligrams twice a day. Furosemide in the morning. Pain medication only if needed. She stopped. Why is the warfarin dose 12 milligrams? Evelyn turned. It isn't. Annie held out the paper. That's what this says. Evelyn took the sheet and read it again. Her expression changed. The discharge order was 5 milligrams. Could they have increased it after the blood test? Grace asked. Not to 12. Evelyn crossed to the computer and opened Grace's chart. She entered her password, then pulled up the medication history. The screen showed an adjustment made at 6:14 that morning. Warfarin, 12 milligrams daily. Approved through the Central Medication Management Office. Evelyn leaned closer. I did not authorize this. Jonathan moved beside her. Who did? The order was entered under Dr. Martin Ellis. Is he on Grace's case? He isn't even in the hospital this week. Annie looked at her mother. What would have happened if she took it? Evelyn did not soften the answer. Her risk of internal bleeding would have increased. With a fresh surgical site, it could have been serious. How serious? Potentially fatal. Grace's face lost color. Jonathan's voice became quiet. Has she received any of the new dose? No, Annie said. The first one was supposed to be given with breakfast. A nurse entered carrying a small medication cup. Everyone looked at it. The nurse stopped. What happened? Evelyn took the cup from her and examined the tablet. Do not give this. Lock the medication cart and notify pharmacy that all orders on Grace Carter's chart are suspended until I review them. The nurse stared at the computer. It was cleared through the system. The system is wrong. The nurse left quickly. Grace reached for Annie's hand. You caught it. Annie's anger arrived before relief. What if I hadn't read the paper? Evelyn turned to Jonathan. We need security logs, pharmacy access records. and the terminal location used to enter that order. I'll get them. No one from Victor's office touches the investigation. They won't, Jonathan called Samuel. Come to Grace's room. Bring Laura, Kim, and Daniel. Tell hospital security to preserve all medication, system logs from midnight onward. Do not use Victor's people. He ended the call and looked at Annie. You should not have had to catch this. But I did. Yes. And the next patient might not. Jonathan held her gaze. I know. Annie stepped closer, lowering her voice so Grace would not hear every word. Did this happen because you started investigating? I don't know. You keep saying that. Because I won't accuse someone without evidence. My mother almost took a dose that could have killed her. Jonathan did not defend himself. If your investigation made her a target, Annie continued, then you brought danger into this room. You're right. The answer stopped her. He went on. I believed assigning security and restricting access would be enough. It wasn't. What are you going to do? Find out who entered the order. And then? Expose everything. Annie shook her head. Don't do it for us. Jonathan said nothing. Do it for the people who never got a second chance to catch the mistake. Samuel arrived with Laura and Daniel. Daniel connected to the medication system through an independent terminal, while Laura documented each step. The login belongs to Dr. Ellis, Daniel said, but the access came from an executive floor workstation. Which office? Jonathan asked. The terminal is assigned to administrative pharmacy oversight. Evelyn folded her arms. That department reports to Victor. Laura looked at Jonathan. This is not yet proof that Victor ordered it. We need access records, camera footage, and the identity of whoever used the terminal. Daniel opened another window. There's more. Someone disabled the automatic high-dose warning for this order. Evelyn stared at the screen. That requires administrator access. Jonathan turned to Samuel. Find everyone with that level of permission. Samuel nodded. Grace spoke from the chair. Jonathan, he went to her. You are not using what happened to me as a reason to destroy evidence by moving too fast. I won't. And you are not protecting the hospital by moving too slowly. I won't do that either. Grace studied his face, then nodded. Jonathan left the room and took the private elevator to the executive floor. Victor was waiting in his office, standing beside the windows with the Chicago skyline behind him. I assume this is about the Carter discharge error, he said. Jonathan closed the door. You knew already. The pharmacy director called me. Before calling Dr. Brooks? Victor ignored the question. Medication mistakes happen in every hospital. This order used a doctor's account while he was out of town. It came from an executive floor terminal. Someone disabled the dosage warning. Victor sat down. You are turning coincidence into conspiracy because you need a villain. Jonathan placed Grace's incorrect prescription on the desk. No, I need the truth. You are simply standing where it leads. Victor's expression hardened. You are destroying this institution over one family. 812 patients. Unverified data. 31 confirmed deaths. Correlation is not causation. And 12 milligrams of warfarin? Victor leaned back. Careful, Jonathan. Accusing me without proof will make you look unstable. Jonathan took out his phone. I am not accusing you yet. He called Samuel while keeping his eyes on Victor. Send the preserved files to the Department of Justice, the Illinois Attorney General, the state health regulator, and Laura's outside counsel. Include the medication logs. Victor stood. You would hand this company to federal investigators? It was never mine to hide. Jonathan ended the call. Victor's composure slipped for the first time. If you do this, the board will remove you tomorrow. Jonathan placed the rejection letter beside the false prescription. Then tomorrow they can decide what matters more to them. When he returned to Grace's room, Annie was checking every medication bottle one more time. Samuel met him outside. The files are gone, he said. Gone where? To every agency you named. Jonathan looked through the glass at Grace and Annie. Are you ready to lose the company? Samuel asked. Jonathan watched Annie compare the label against her notebook. I was almost killed once by fire, he said. I will not spend the rest of my life protecting smoke. The next morning, the emergency meeting of the Hayes Medical Holdings Board was moved up by 6 hours. Victor intended to remove Jonathan before the evidence became public. Jonathan arrived with no speech prepared and nothing left to protect except the truth. The emergency board meeting began at 7 in the morning in the glass-walled conference room above downtown Chicago. Snow pressed against the windows, turning the city below into a gray outline. 12 directors sat around the polished table. Victor Lang occupied the chair opposite Jonathan, a stack of financial reports arranged in front of him. Helen sat 2 seats away, her expression unreadable. Jonathan entered alone. No attorneys followed him. No communications team waited outside. He carried a thin folder containing Grace Carter's rejection letter, the altered prescription, and a list of 31 confirmed deaths. Victor glanced at the empty doorway behind him. "Where's your counsel?" "Reviewing the documents you tried to delete." Several directors shifted in their seats. Victor's mouth tightened. "This meeting was called to address your conduct, not mine." Jonathan took his place at the head of the table. "Then begin." Victor pressed a button, and the wall screen filled with charts showing falling stock prices, lender concerns, and projected losses from the canceled Northbridge merger. "In the past 72 hours, Victor said, Mr. Hayes has suspended a multi-billion-dollar transaction, launched an unauthorized internal investigation, released protected corporate records to government agencies, and exposed this institution to lawsuits that may threaten thousands of jobs." A director named Robert Hale leaned forward. "Is that accurate, Jonathan?" "Yes." The blunt answer unsettled the room more than a denial would have. Victor continued. "His decisions began after an emotional encounter with a patient's daughter. Since then, he has allowed unresolved trauma from an 18-year-old accident to influence corporate policy." Jonathan looked around the table. "Did Victor tell you what happened to the patient?" "This is not about one patient," Victor said. "You're right." Jonathan opened his folder and placed a copy of the first file before Helen. Walter Bell, 62, a sanitation worker for the city of Chicago. His physician ordered urgent cardiac imaging. Hayes Memorial delayed it for 6 weeks while his financial status was reviewed. He died in his kitchen before breakfast. Helen passed the file to the next director. Jonathan placed another on the table. Marisol Vega, 41, hotel housekeeper. Her cancer referral was returned twice because the English and Spanish financial forms did not match. She was diagnosed at stage 4. A third file followed. Calvin Price, Vietnam veteran. His vascular procedure was deferred for 9 weeks. By the time he reached an emergency room, surgeons could not save his leg. Victor folded his hands. "Anecdotes do not establish misconduct." Jonathan faced him. 812 patients were assigned the DRA designation over 3 years. The wall screen changed. Daniel Ortiz appeared by secure video from outside counsel's office. He displayed the recovered database. DRA stands for Deferred Resource Allocation, Daniel explained. Patients with low reimbursement insurance, unresolved Medicaid status, or no insurance were more likely to receive the code. Black patients received it at more than twice the rate of comparable white patients. Latino patients were also disproportionately affected. One director raised his hand. "Could geography and income account for that difference?" "We adjusted for both," Daniel said. "The disparity remained." Victor interrupted. "This analysis has not been peer-reviewed. It has been preserved for federal review," Jonathan said. Victor turned toward the board. DRA was designed to manage limited capacity. Every hospital must make difficult decisions. Dr. Evelyn Brooks entered through the side door. Victor stared at her. "You were not invited." Helen spoke before Jonathan could. "I invited her." Evelyn placed 3 letters on the table. These were sent to Mr. Hayes' office over 18 months. 9 physicians warned that medically urgent patients were being delayed for financial reasons. Robert Hale examined the routing stamps. They were forwarded to hospital administration. "To Victor's office," Evelyn said. Victor looked at Jonathan. "Your office followed standard procedure?" "Yes," Jonathan replied. "A procedure I created." The room quieted. Jonathan stood but did not move away from his chair. "I signed the governance report that allowed DRA to operate. I rewarded lower costs and higher margins. I accepted summaries because they were convenient. I did not ask which patients disappeared from the schedule to make our performance look better." Victor's eyes narrowed. He had expected Jonathan to defend himself. Jonathan continued. "Victor designed the machinery. I provided the building, the money, and the silence in which it operated." Helen lowered her gaze to Walter Bell's file. Victor pushed back his chair. "This is theater. You are confessing to negligence so you can appear honorable while blaming everyone beneath you. I'm not asking this board to spare me." "Then what are you asking?" "To stop protecting the system Victor pointed toward the financial projections. If these records become public, Hayes Memorial could lose major contracts. Smaller facilities may close. Employees who never saw a DRA code will lose their jobs. Evelyn looked at him. A hospital is not a country club. The poor are not trespassers. Victor ignored her. Healthcare requires money. Sentiment does not keep operating rooms open. Jonathan removed Grace's altered prescription from the folder. Yesterday, someone used the account of a doctor who was out of town to change Grace Carter's warfarin dose from 5 milligrams to 12. The automatic warning was disabled. The order came from an executive floor terminal assigned to administrative pharmacy oversight. Several directors began speaking at once. Victor remained still. Medication errors occur. Someone tried to erase the access log afterward. That proves nothing about me. Not yet. Jonathan placed the prescription beside Grace's rejection letter, but it proves the danger did not end when the audit began. Laura Kim appeared beside Daniel on the video screen. Preserved copies of the DRA records, medication logs, fund transfers, and deletion orders have been delivered to the Department of Justice, the Illinois Attorney General, and the state health regulator. Victor's composure finally broke. You had no authority to disclose protected company material. I had a duty to preserve evidence. You've destroyed this company. Jonathan looked at the names spread across the table. A company that survives by hiding the dead is already destroyed. Victor turned to the board. I move for the immediate removal of Jonathan Hayes as chairman. Robert Hale seconded the motion. Helen raised her hand before the vote began. I have another motion. Victor Lang is suspended from all duties pending the criminal and regulatory investigations. His access to hospital systems ends immediately. Victor stared at her. Helen, think carefully. I have. Before anyone could call the vote, the conference room doors opened. 2 federal investigators entered with representatives from the Illinois Attorney General's office and hospital security. The lead investigator approached Victor. Mr. Lang, we have a warrant for records, electronic devices, and access credentials connected to Hayes Memorial's financial eligibility program. Victor looked at Jonathan. For years, people had lowered their eyes when Victor entered a room. Now every director watched as security collected his phone and laptop. This is not over, Victor said. Jonathan did not smile. No, it's only no longer hidden. After Victor was escorted out, the board remained silent. Helen touched the stack of files. What happens to you? Jonathan looked at his own signature on the DRA report, the same thing that should happen to anyone whose decisions helped cause this. I answer for it. Outside the windows, Chicago was beginning another workday. Inside the room, the company Jonathan had built was finally being forced to look at the people it had trained itself not to see. The board removed Jonathan as chairman before noon. The vote was not unanimous, but it did not need to be. By the time the final hand rose, Jonathan had already placed his access card, executive phone, and office keys on the table. He did not argue. Helen watched him gather the remaining files. You could have delayed the vote, she said. Laura thinks we had grounds. For what? To protect your position until the investigation is complete. Jonathan looked at the list of names still spread across the table. That position protected me for too long. Outside the conference room, reporters filled the executive lobby. Cameras turned as soon as the doors opened. Questions came from every direction. Mr. Hayes, did you know patients were being denied? Are you resigning? Will you face criminal charges? Did Victor Lang act alone? Jonathan stopped in front of the microphones. Claire stood several feet away, holding a prepared statement he had refused to read. I did not know enough, Jonathan said, because I chose not to know enough. The room grew quieter. I signed reports without asking who paid for the improvements they described. I rewarded lower costs and higher margins. I trusted a system because it kept difficult decisions away from my desk. A reporter called out, "Are you admitting responsibility for the deaths?" I am admitting responsibility for helping create the conditions in which those decisions were made. Did you order anyone to deny care? No. Then why resign? Jonathan looked directly into the cameras. Because responsibility begins where excuses end. He announced that he was stepping down from all executive positions, surrendering voting control of Hayes Memorial during the investigation, and placing a substantial portion of his shares into a court-supervised compensation fund. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not mention Grace saving his life. He did not mention Annie sitting alone in the corridor. This was not a story about his redemption yet. It was a record of what he had allowed. When the statement ended, Samuel guided him through the side exit. The Lincoln waited at the curb, but Jonathan stopped before getting in. "Take me to Grace's apartment." Samuel looked at his suit. "You may want to change first." "Why? You look like you're going to foreclose on the building." Jonathan glanced down at himself. 20 minutes later, they stopped at his penthouse. He changed into a dark sweater, plain coat, and shoes that could survive a Chicago sidewalk without polishing. He left the watch in the bedroom drawer. By early evening, the smell of roasted chicken and cornbread filled the hallway outside Grace's apartment. The building's heating system had been repaired that afternoon after city inspectors issued an emergency order. Jonathan had arranged the inspection but had kept his name off the paperwork. Grace would have objected if she knew. Annie opened the door. "You came. Your mother invited me. She said you might need dinner." Jonathan looked past her. "I'm beginning to think your mother believes food can solve anything." "No. She believes hungry people make worse decisions." Inside, folding chairs had been added around a small table. Grace sat near the radiator wearing the blue shawl from New Hope Baptist. Ruth, the hospital volunteer, had sent flowers. Mrs. Powell from the church had brought collard greens. Samuel carried in a peach cobbler from the bakery downstairs. Jonathan paused at the doorway. The room was crowded with people who had no financial reason to be there. A retired teacher arranged plates. A church deacon checked the loose railing outside. Lorraine Bell stood near the sink, speaking quietly with Grace. When she saw Jonathan, she did not smile. "You found your way south again," she said. "Yes." "Good. We were beginning to think your car only turned one direction." Samuel coughed into his hand. Grace pointed toward an empty chair. "Sit down before the food gets cold." Jonathan sat. Before dinner, Grace asked him to say grace. He looked at her. "I don't think I'm qualified." "You don't need a license." The room waited. Jonathan lowered his head. "Thank you for the food," he began. "For the people who prepared it. For Grace being alive. For Annie noticing what others missed. And for the chance to tell the truth, even when it came late." He stopped. Grace said, "Amen." The others repeated it. Dinner moved without ceremony. People passed dishes, asked Grace about her recovery, and argued over whether Samuel should take a second piece of cornbread. Annie checked her mother's medication before dessert. Jonathan watched her read the label twice. Lorraine noticed. "She saved her mother, didn't she?" "Yes. She should not have had to." "No." Lorraine placed her fork down. Walter would have liked her. He trusted anybody who read instructions before touching a machine. Grace looked at Jonathan. "How many families have agreed to speak?" 17 so far. "And the others?" "Some refused. Some want lawyers present. A few hung up when they heard the Hayes name." "They had that right." "I know." "Do you?" Jonathan accepted the question. "I'm learning." After dinner, Grace asked Annie to bring the yellow notebook from the bedroom. Annie returned with the notebook and a college application folded inside it. She placed the papers in front of Jonathan. I filled out most of it. He opened the application. The school was a public university with a strong pharmacy program. Annie had written about caring for Grace, catching medication errors, and wanting to help patients understand treatment after they left the hospital. At the section asking how she planned to finance her education, the space remained blank. "The scholarship foundation is not ready yet," Jonathan said. "I know. It will be independent." "I know that too. You may not be selected. That's why I'm applying to 6 other programs." Jonathan looked at her. Annie lifted one shoulder. "You said I needed a plan." Grace smiled from across the table. Jonathan handed the papers back. "You don't need my signature." "I know. Then why show me?" Annie thought about it. "Because you asked what I would study if money wasn't part of the decision." "And?" "I wanted you to know," I answered. Jonathan nodded. That was enough. Later, after the neighbors left, Grace walked him to the door. She moved slowly but refused Annie's arm. Jonathan looked at the scar along her forearm. "You saved me twice," he said. Grace frowned. "We've discussed this. The first time, you pulled me out of a burning airplane. And the second, you made me see the fire I had learned to call success." Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she shook her head. "Annie did that." Jonathan glanced toward the table, where Annie was organizing the medication bottles. Grace continued, I saved your life. She made you decide what to do with it. Outside, Samuel waited beside the Lincoln. As Jonathan stepped onto the sidewalk, his phone rang. It was Laura Kim. Victor has been formally charged, she said. Fraud, obstruction, misuse of charitable funds, falsification of medical records, and conspiracy related to the altered prescription. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. Will there be more charges? Likely. The investigation is widening. And the hospital? The board approved independent oversight. Community representatives will receive seats. The compensation fund is moving forward. Jonathan looked back through the apartment window. Grace was seated at the table now, while Annie explained something from the yellow notebook. For the first time since leaving the boardroom, he felt no urge to control what happened next. What happens to me? He asked. Laura paused. Civil cases, regulatory penalties, possibly testimony before the state legislature. You may lose most of your holdings. Jonathan looked at the repaired light above the building entrance. All right. You say that now. I should have said it years ago. He ended the call. Samuel opened the car door. Jonathan did not get in immediately. Across the street, children were drawing lines in the thin snow with their boots. Someone inside the corner store laughed. A church bell marked the hour. Jonathan had lost the company that carried his name. For the first time, he could see the people who had been standing beneath it. 4 months later, Annie sat before the scholarship committee in a borrowed navy blazer and tried not to look at Jonathan. He was not seated with the panel. That had been Grace's condition, and Jonathan had accepted it without argument. He waited at the back of the community center beside Samuel, far enough away that Annie could forget he was there if she needed to. The committee included a public school counselor, a pharmacist from Cook County, a retired nurse, a representative from New Hope Baptist Church, and a former Hayes Memorial patient. None of them worked for Jonathan. The pharmacist glanced at Annie's application. Why clinical pharmacy? Annie kept both hands on her lap. Because medicine doesn't stop working when a patient leaves the hospital. People go home with bottles they can't pronounce, instructions they don't understand, and nobody to call after 5 o'clock. The retired nurse leaned forward. You caught an error in your mother's discharge medication. Yes. Do you believe families should be responsible for finding medical mistakes? No. Annie's answer came quickly. But they should be allowed to ask questions without being treated like a problem. The former patient looked at her. What would you change first? I'd make sure every patient leaves with one list written in plain language. Not 3 lists from 3 departments. I'd put a phone number on it that a real person answers. And I'd make sure the person explaining the medicine asks the patient to repeat it back. Why? Because nodding doesn't mean understanding. Sometimes it just means people are embarrassed. At the back of the room, Jonathan remembered how often he had nodded through reports he had not truly understood. The counselor asked the final question. If you receive this scholarship, are you required to work for the Hayes system? No. Would you choose to? Annie glanced toward Jonathan for the first time. Only if it becomes the kind of place where I'm allowed to tell the truth. Samuel turned slightly toward Jonathan. That may be the most expensive job condition you've ever heard. Jonathan kept his voice low. It's still reasonable. The committee dismissed Annie and called in the next applicant. Outside the room, she exhaled and loosened her collar. Grace waited near the entrance with a cane she used only on long walks. How did it go? She asked. I think I talked too fast. You always think that. I corrected one of the interviewers. Grace raised an eyebrow. Then they met the real you. Jonathan approached but stopped several feet away. Annie looked at him. You weren't supposed to influence them. I didn't. Samuel smiled during my answer. That was Samuel's face acting independently. Samuel nodded. It has become difficult to manage since retirement. He had officially retired 2 weeks earlier, though he still drove Jonathan to community meetings and medical appointments. When asked why, Samuel said Jonathan had spent 50 years learning to arrive at important places and still needed help recognizing them. Annie received the scholarship 3 days later. The award covered tuition, books, transportation, and clinical training. She was one of 12 students selected that year. 4 came from the South Side, 3 from Latino neighborhoods on the West Side, 2 from rural Illinois, and the rest from families who had been pushed into debt by medical costs. Jonathan learned the result from Grace, not the committee. You didn't ask them? She said over the phone. I promised I wouldn't. I'm surprised you survived. Sueni. Annie began college that fall. The years that followed did not move easily. Grace returned to part-time work but never regained the stamina she had before surgery. Jonathan testified before the Illinois legislature and spent months answering questions from federal regulators. Hayes Memorial paid settlements to dozens of families, while several civil cases continued. Victor Lang was convicted of fraud, obstruction, misuse of charitable funds, and falsification of medical records. Evidence tied his office to the altered warfarin order, though prosecutors could not prove he had entered it himself. The court found that he had directed employees to interfere with medical records and destroy evidence after the audit began. Jonathan lost control of Hayes' medical holdings. Most of his voting shares were transferred into a court-supervised public trust. The hospital remained open under an independent board that included physicians, nurses, patient advocates, and community representatives. Some newspapers described Jonathan as a whistleblower. Others called him the man who exposed a system only after benefiting from it. He kept both versions. When a reporter asked which one was true, he answered, both. During Annie's first year, she called him after failing an organic chemistry exam. I studied for 2 weeks, she said. I knew everything until they put the paper in front of me. Jonathan sat in a public meeting room at the time, waiting to hear complaints about hospital billing. What did your professor say? That one test doesn't decide whether I belong there. Do you believe her? No. Do you believe me? Not on this. He smiled despite himself. Good. Speak to the tutoring center. Annie passed the course. In her 3rd year, she worked weekends at a community pharmacy. She learned that patients often split tablets to make prescriptions last longer. Some chose which medicines to fill based on rent and grocery prices. Others nodded through instructions because they did not want to admit they could not read them. She wrote every pattern down in a new yellow notebook. Grace kept the original at home. 5 years after the surgery, Annie completed her first professional training and began supervised work as a patient medication navigator. She continued toward her clinical pharmacy qualification while helping surgical patients organize prescriptions, understand interactions, and apply for assistance. The job was not at Hayes Memorial. It was at a new center being built near the Southside Clinic, where Grace had first been treated. Jonathan visited the construction site one Friday afternoon. The old municipal building had been renovated rather than demolished. Its brick exterior remained, but the windows had been replaced, the elevators repaired, and the treatment rooms widened for wheelchairs. A blue sign waited beneath a canvas cover. Grace stood in the lobby with Evelyn and Lorraine Bell. Her hair had more gray in it now. The scar along her left arm remained visible beneath her rolled sleeve. You made it too large, Grace told Jonathan. The planning committee chose the size. You paid for part of it. So did the settlement fund, the city, 2 foundations, and 3 churches. You're getting better at sharing credit. I've had practice. Annie entered carrying a cardboard box. Inside were medication organizers, printed instructions, and the original yellow notebook. Jonathan looked at it. Why did you bring that? Annie walked toward a corner near the patient counseling rooms. Against the wall sat a blue plastic chair from the old surgical corridor at Hayes Memorial. When the hospital renovated the floor, she had asked for it instead of letting it be discarded. She placed the notebook beneath a small framed sentence above the chair. No one should have to wait alone. Grace read the words. That chair is uncomfortable. It's symbolic, Annie said. It can be symbolic with a cushion. Evelyn laughed. I'll approve that modification. The center would offer medication reviews, post-surgical support, transportation for older patients, insurance appeals, nutrition counseling, and a phone line staffed by people trained to answer questions in plain language. Its governing board had offered Annie a permanent role after she completed her remaining qualifications. Jonathan had not participated in the hiring decision. He had learned about it after Annie accepted. What will your title be? He asked. For now, patient medication navigator and post-surgical care coordinator. And later, if I finish the PharmD program and pass my licensing exams, clinical pharmacist. When, Grace corrected. Annie smiled. When, outside, workers fastened the last letters above the entrance. Grace Carter Center for Patient Dignity. Grace looked up at her own name and shook her head. I still think this is too much. Lorraine stood beside her. Walter would have said the same thing. Grace reached for her hand. Jonathan watched the 2 women face the sign together. One had survived because Annie caught a mistake. The other had buried a husband before anyone corrected his file. The center could not make those outcomes equal. It could only make them impossible to ignore. Annie came to stand beside Jonathan. "You opened the door," he said. She looked toward the counseling rooms. "No, a lot of people opened it." Then she nodded toward the waiting area, where the old blue chair stood beneath the framed words. "The important part is what happens when somebody walks through." The Grace Carter Center for Patient Dignity opened on a clear Saturday morning in October, almost 6 years after Grace's surgery. By 9 o'clock, the sidewalk outside the renovated brick building was crowded. Former patients arrived with relatives. Nurses from Hayes Memorial stood beside volunteers from New Hope Baptist Church. Medical students passed out programs while children drew hearts in chalk near the entrance. Grace waited beside the blue ribbon with Annie on one side and Dr. Evelyn Brooks on the other. She wore a dark green dress and had left her cane at home, though Annie had objected. "You're going to be standing for an hour," Annie said. "I survived heart surgery and 5 years of your reminders. I can survive a ribbon. You said that about the stairs last week. I reached the top. You sat down for 10 minutes. That is still reaching the top." Jonathan listened from several feet away. He wore a plain gray suit without a company pin. He no longer had an executive office or a reserved parking space at Hayes Memorial. His role at the new center was limited to an unpaid advisory position without voting authority. That arrangement had been his suggestion. Samuel stood beside him, officially retired and carrying a travel mug that said "World's Most Patient Driver." Jonathan glanced at it. "Who gave you that?" "Annie." "It isn't accurate." Samuel took a slow drink. "I spent 23 years waiting outside your meetings." Helen arrived with her husband and 2 adult children. Behind them came Lorraine Bell, carrying a framed photograph of Walter in his Little League coaching shirt. Other families brought photographs too. The center had created a remembrance wall inside, not to turn grief into decoration but to preserve the names once buried under administrative codes. A reporter approached Jonathan. "Mr. Hayes, why doesn't this building carry your name?" Jonathan looked toward Grace. "Because writing a check was the easiest thing anyone did here. Do you consider the center part of your legacy?" "No." The reporter waited for more. Jonathan continued, "A legacy is what remains after people stop praising the person who paid for it. Ask the patients in 10 years. When the ceremony began, Evelyn spoke first. She described the center's services without using corporate language: medication reviews, transportation for elderly patients, insurance appeals, follow-up calls after surgery, and staff trained to explain instructions without making patients feel ashamed. Lorraine stepped forward next. "My husband Walter never entered this building," she said. "He died while waiting for a hospital to decide whether he qualified for a test. This center cannot give him back to me. It can make sure the next Walter Bell is treated like a person before he becomes a case number." She placed his photograph on a table beside the entrance. No one applauded at first. The silence was more respectful. Then Grace approached the microphone. She looked uncomfortable with the attention and ignored the prepared speech Annie had printed for her. "I was asked what I did to deserve my name on this building," Grace said. "The honest answer is that I got sick in a way people could no longer ignore." Annie lowered the pages in her hand. Grace continued. "There are people all over this city who are still being quiet about pain because they cannot afford the answer. Some are working 2 jobs. Some are raising children. Some are taking care of parents while pretending they are not tired." She glanced at Jonathan. "Helping one person is good. Changing the reason that person needed saving is better." Jonathan lowered his eyes. Grace turned toward Annie. "My daughter understood that before the rest of us." Annie stepped forward wearing the white coat from her clinical training program. Her badge identified her as a patient medication navigator and post-surgical care coordinator. She had finished the academic portion of her pharmacy program and was preparing for her final licensing requirements. "My mother taught me that saving a life is not a transaction," Annie said. "Mr. Hayes taught me something too." Jonathan looked up. "People can change," she continued, "but only when change costs them something." The words were not praise. Jonathan understood that, and he was grateful. Annie described the blue chair inside the counseling area. "It came from the hallway where I waited during my mother's surgery. I asked a stranger to sit with me because I was afraid. That stranger turned out to own the hospital, but ownership wasn't what helped me that day. He helped because he stayed." Grace cut the ribbon. The crowd entered. Inside, older patients met with volunteers about prescription costs. A young mother sat with a nurse who explained her son's discharge instructions in Spanish. Samuel helped a veteran complete a transportation request. Evelyn examined the clinic rooms and found 3 things she wanted changed before Monday. Jonathan remained near the back. No one asked him to lead. He found that he did not mind. In the afternoon, after the crowd thinned, Grace mentioned she had a routine cardiology appointment at Hayes Memorial. Annie immediately collected her bag. "I can drive you," Jonathan said. Grace looked at Samuel. "Does he know how?" Samuel sighed. Technically, they arrived at the hospital an hour later. The surgical floor had been renovated. The walls were warmer in color, and the old plastic chairs had been replaced with padded seats. Yet the corridor still carried the same mixture of antiseptic, coffee, and restrained fear. Grace went into the examination room with a nurse. Annie and Jonathan sat outside. For several minutes, neither spoke. Jonathan no longer wore the watch his father had given him. It remained in a drawer at home. He had stopped measuring every room by how quickly he could leave it. "Do you still hate waiting?" Annie asked. "Yes." She smiled. "Me too." "Do you still get scared?" "Sometimes." "What helps?" Annie looked at the empty chair between them, knowing someone chose not to leave. A physician passed with a chart. An older couple spoke quietly near the elevator. Somewhere down the hall, a child laughed at something a nurse had said. Annie shifted closer. "Could you sit beside me until Mom's appointment is over?" Jonathan looked toward the closed door. "I'm not going anywhere." Grace's examination lasted 43 minutes. Jonathan did not check the time once. 18 years before their first meeting, Grace Carter had pulled him from a burning airplane. She had saved his life without asking his name, his income, or what he could give her in return. Years later, Annie had found him walking past a frightened girl and asked him to sit down. Grace had given Jonathan more time. Annie had taught him what that time was for. When the examination room door finally opened, both of them stood. Grace stepped into the hallway with good news from her doctor and a familiar complaint about hospital coffee. Jonathan took her coat. Annie carried her medical folder. The 3 of them walked toward the elevator together, leaving the chairs empty behind them. For the first time, no one had waited alone. This story reminds us that true kindness is not measured by wealth, status, or public praise, but by the courage to stay when someone is afraid, and by the willingness to act when a system treats people unfairly. Jonathan could not undo the suffering caused by his hospital, but he could stop hiding behind ignorance, accept responsibility, and use his power to protect those who had been ignored. Grace showed that compassion should never become a debt, while Annie proved that one honest voice can expose injustice and change lives. The lesson is simple. People may not always need us to fix everything, but no one should have to face fear, pain, or injustice alone. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.